The cool morning breeze swept across the sleepy town of Luoyang. A typical day in the peaceful countryside, birds chirping, the sun rising lazily over the horizon, and the hustle of life just beginning. But amidst this calm, something dark was about to emerge from the river that ran alongside the village. A discovery that would change everything. It was a quiet walk that turned into a chilling mystery. As Cao Ho Bá walked along the river, his mind was focused on the mundane. The sound of his footsteps on the gravel path echoed in the stillness, the only sign of life in an otherwise untouched landscape. But then, as he neared a quieter bend in the river, something caught his eye. A dark shape bobbing up and down in the water. At first, he thought it was just debris, a bag or some kind of trash left behind. But as it came closer, his heart skipped a beat. This wasn't trash. It was something far more unsettling. Curiosity piqued, Cao Ho Bá crouched down and peered closer. What he saw made his blood run cold. A foot, unmistakably human, sticking out from the fabric of a large woven bag. The bag, bobbing helplessly in the water, carried something far darker than he had imagined. In that moment, Cao Ho Bá knew this wasn't a mere accident or garbage. A human life had ended here. His breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him like a wave. This wasn't just an abandoned body, it was evidence of something far more sinister. Without wasting another moment, he pulled out his phone and dialed the local authorities, his hand trembling. The police needed to know what he had found, and they needed to come immediately. The police arrived swiftly after receiving the call. The investigation team, led by experienced officers, made their way to the riverbank where Cao Ho Bá had found the body. They surveyed the area, confirming the location, and immediately set to work. The water was low here, and with minimal effort, they managed to wade through and retrieve the bag from the river's edge. As the bag was lifted, the grim reality became even clearer. The body inside had been submerged for days, the weight of the water having done its damage. The forensic team moved quickly, their expressions somber as they took in the details. A male, roughly 1.7 meters tall, dressed in black pants and a windbreaker. His hands were tightly bound with ropes, and his body was weighed down with rocks. This was no accidental death. It was a murder carefully planned and executed. Despite the obvious signs of death, the victim's identity was still unknown. The forensic experts noted that the body showed signs of water exposure, with swollen skin and a grayish tint to the extremities. The corpse had been in the water for a significant period, 5 to 7 days, they estimated, allowing the decomposition to begin. But one thing was certain, this man had not drowned by accident. The marks on his body, especially around his neck, pointed to suffocation. The forensic team's initial conclusion was chilling. The victim had been suffocated, most likely strangled, either by hand or with a soft material like a rope. The bruises on the neck, clearly formed before death, left little room for doubt. But the question remained, who would want to kill this man, and why? As the body was transported for further examination, the investigation into his identity became the top priority. Back at the scene, officers began looking for other clues. The area around the riverbank showed no signs of disturbance, no recent tracks, no signs of a struggle. It was clear that the killer had chosen this remote location for a reason, to avoid being seen. The body had been dumped here after death, the rocks used to weigh it down, a deliberate measure to keep it from floating away. As the investigation continued, the police delved deeper into the circumstances surrounding the death. a critical piece of evidence emerged: a set of keys found in the victim's pocket. Among the keys was a remote control key for a vehicle made by Ankai, a well-known vehicle manufacturer in China. This discovery would lead the investigators down a path of corporate ties and potential motives far beyond a simple robbery. The presence of the Ankai key raised more questions than it answered. Was the victim a driver? Had he worked for a transportation company? The remote control key was an unusual find, considering the victim had no obvious connections to the vehicle manufacturer. The investigators began tracing the vehicle connections, hoping this would lead to answers about the victim's identity and his final moments. Days passed, and the search for answers intensified. Through a painstaking investigation, the police uncovered a lead. This key matched a vehicle registered to a local transport company, and the driver of the vehicle was none other than Nhậm, a bus driver who had been reported missing several days ago. The connection was clear: the victim was Nhậm. But what had happened to him? Why had he been killed? As they continued to piece together the puzzle, the focus shifted to the man's personal life. Nhậm was a quiet man, dedicated to his work as a bus driver. He had no criminal record and no apparent enemies. But the deeper the investigators dug, the more they found a complicated web of relationships, jealousy, and betrayal, all of which pointed to a dangerous mix of love, anger, and revenge. The question lingered in the air: who was behind Nhậm brutal death? As the investigation into his personal relationships and connections continued, it became clear that his tragic end was tied to more than just a random crime. Someone had orchestrated his death. But who? And what was their motive? Was it personal? Was it about money? Or was it something darker, hidden beneath the surface? As the scene closed, the investigators were left with one haunting question: how deep did the web of lies, secrets, and betrayal really go? Could they unravel it before the killer struck again? As the forensic team arrived at the site, they quickly took over the scene. The body, now safely pulled from the river, was laid out on the banks, the sun casting a dim glow over the chilling discovery. Despite the initial shock, the team worked quickly and efficiently, knowing that every detail would matter. The forensic pathologists immediately got to work, observing the body closely. What they found was unsettling. The signs of prolonged exposure to water were clear, and the victim's body showed all the typical signs of someone who had been submerged for several days. The victim's skin had taken on a grisly appearance, swollen and bloated from the water. The extremities were discolored, and the skin looked wrinkled as though it had been submerged for an extended period. The most telling sign was the faint grayish tint around the fingertips and toes, typical of a body that had been in the water too long. The forensic team noted that the body had been in the water for at least 5 to 7 days. The heat of the summer, combined with the lack of oxygen in the river, contributed to the body's slow decomposition process. Despite the obvious signs of decomposition, the forensic team noticed that the victim did not have the typical injuries associated with drowning. No signs of trauma that would suggest an accidental death. Instead, their focus shifted to the neck area. Upon closer inspection, the pathologists found faint bruising marks on the skin around the neck, which immediately raised suspicion. These bruises seemed like the result of an external force, possibly from being strangled or asphyxiated. The more they investigated, the clearer it became: this was not a simple drowning accident. The bruising indicated that the victim had been suffocated before being discarded into the water. The presence of these marks, particularly on the neck, suggested the killer had used force to block the victim's airway, potentially using a soft object like a rope, or even their hands. The forensic pathologists couldn't be certain yet, but it was clear that the victim had met a violent end. The team continued their examination, noting that despite the lack of external wounds, there were other subtle clues that hinted at a struggle. There were no obvious wounds like knife cuts or blunt force trauma, yet the victim's body language suggested that he had fought for his life. The bruising near the neck was indicative of a struggle. Perhaps the victim had been restrained, held in place against his will, and suffocated in a desperate attempt to silence him. Another significant find came when the forensic team uncovered additional signs of trauma. While the body was mostly intact, there were slight marks on the arms and wrists, which seemed to suggest that the victim had been bound or tied at some point. The wounds were superficial, but they were enough to point to a struggle or restraint, which further confirmed that the victim had not died quietly or peacefully. Something violent had happened, and it was far from an accident. As the body was further examined, a crucial detail came to light. The victim's clothing had been thoroughly soaked, but there were no signs of trauma to the clothes themselves. However, the victim's hands were carefully examined. Surprisingly, there were traces of blood under the fingernails, suggesting that in the final moments of his life, the victim had been fighting. These were signs that he had been involved in some kind of violent altercation, possibly with the person responsible for his death. The forensic findings were now clear. The victim had been murdered. The cause of death appeared to be suffocation, and the bruising around his neck indicated he had been deliberately strangled. The marks on his wrists and under his nails pointed to a violent struggle before death. Whoever had killed this man had been personal, likely someone the victim knew. The killing was planned and executed with cold precision. But the question remained, who was this man, and why had he been targeted? Despite the breakthrough in the forensic examination, there was still no solid lead on the victim's identity. The body had been in the water too long for any distinguishing features to be visible, and there was no immediate way to identify him. The authorities turned to other sources, hoping to find some clue that could connect this case to someone in the town. They scoured the riverbank and surrounding areas for any possible witnesses, hoping for a breakthrough. As the forensic findings were catalogued, a breakthrough came. Among the victim's personal belongings, hidden within his clothes, was a set of keys, a remote control key for a vehicle made by the Chinese automaker Ankai. The key's discovery was a turning point in the investigation. It wasn't just a random object, it was a connection to something bigger, something that might reveal the identity of the victim and the possible motive behind his death. The discovery of the Ankai key led the investigators to an important breakthrough. It wasn't just a random item, it was tied to a vehicle used by a local transport company. The victim, it seemed, had been connected to this company. But the deeper the investigation went, the more unsettling the possibilities became. Was the victim a driver? Was he involved in something illegal? Or was there a more personal reason behind his death? The search for answers had only just begun. With the key as their only lead, the authorities turned their attention to the transport company. They began investigating its employees, trying to uncover who had access to the vehicle linked to the key. As the investigation unfolded, they discovered that the victim had been a bus driver for the company, a man named Nhậm Quân, who had gone missing a few days before his body was discovered. Was this the breakthrough they needed? Or was this just the beginning of an even darker mystery? The investigation into Nhậm Quan's background revealed a quiet man, respected in his community, but with a complex personal life. There were hints of a love triangle, one involving a woman named Thuy, and a tangled web of jealousy and betrayal that may have played a key role in his death. As they dug deeper, the police began to uncover the dark side of Enam Kwan's life, a side that no one had expected, leading them closer to understanding why he had been killed. As the search for clues continued, the question was no longer just about who had killed Enam Kwan, but why. What had pushed someone to murder a respected bus driver? Was it greed, jealousy, or something deeper? The truth was beginning to surface, but the investigation was far from over. With each new detail, the case grew more complex, and the answers seemed further out of reach. With the forensic findings in hand, the investigators knew they were on the cusp of uncovering something significant. The key to unraveling this mystery lay in the seemingly insignificant objects that were found with the body. Among them was a set of keys, a remote car key, worn and weathered, but clearly marked with the distinctive logo of the Chinese automaker, Ankai. At first, it seemed like a mere coincidence, a random item that could be tied to any vehicle. But the more the investigators examined it, the more they realized this key was far from ordinary. With the key as their only tangible lead, the police immediately started digging into the local transport company's records. They learned that the victim, Enam Kwan, had been a driver for the company for several years. His disappearance, however, had been reported just a few days before the body was discovered. The more the police learned about Enam Kwan, the more they realized that his life was far more complex than they had initially believed. With the key as their only tangible lead, the police immediately started digging into the local transport company's records. They learned that the victim, Enam Kwan, had been a driver for the company for several years. His disappearance, however, had been reported just a few days before the body was discovered. The more the police learned about Enam Kwan, the more they realized that his life was far more complex than they had initially believed. Enam Kwan was a quiet, reserved man who kept to himself for the most part. His colleagues described him as hardworking and dependable, but the deeper the investigation went, the more complicated his personal life appeared. It was uncovered that Enam Kwan had been involved in a love affair with a woman named Thuy, a woman who was married to another man. This revelation raised new questions. Was the motive behind his murder tied to this love triangle? Was his death a crime of passion, or was it something darker? Enam Kwan's affair with Thuy seemed to have stirred up more than just romantic feelings. It was discovered that her husband, Lak Tai, had grown increasingly suspicious and jealous of the relationship. He had confronted Enam Kwan on several occasions, demanding that he stay away from his wife. But what the police didn't know yet was just how far Lak Tai was willing to go to remove Enam Kwan from his life. Despite the mounting tension, there was no clear evidence that Lak Tai had been directly involved in the murder. However, the investigators began to explore the possibility that his jealousy and anger may have played a crucial role in what happened next. As they continued to dig into the victim's personal life, they stumbled upon another significant lead: a set of phone records that tied Enam Kwan to an unknown number, a call that was made shortly before he disappeared. The call records led the investigators to a mysterious man named Tao Ludon, a local who had no prior connection to Enam Kwan. Tao Ludon was identified as the man who had been in contact with Enam Kwan just before his disappearance. The timing was uncanny, just hours before the victim was last seen alive. Tao Ludon, however, had no obvious ties to the murder, and his relationship with Enam Kwan seemed to be nothing more than a coincidence. Or so it seemed. The investigators then turned their attention to Tao Ludon's movements. They discovered that he had been in the same area as Enam Kwan on the day he disappeared. The two men had crossed paths in a cafe, where they were seen talking briefly. However, what was more disturbing was the fact that, shortly after their interaction, Cao Ludon was seen with another man, someone unfamiliar to the investigators. Who was this man, and why had they been together so shortly after Enam Kwan's disappearance? The investigation quickly took a dramatic turn as surveillance footage from a nearby hotel revealed even more troubling details. Cao Ludon was captured entering the hotel with the same woman who had been seen with Enam Kwan earlier that day. It seemed that she had been involved in the unfolding drama, but the question was, how far had her role gone? Was she a victim, a pawn in someone else's game, or was she more involved in the death of Enam Kwan than anyone had anticipated? With the discovery of this new lead, the investigators' suspicions of Thuy's involvement deepened. The footage from the hotel had revealed her taking part in something much darker than anyone had imagined. But her role in the murder was still unclear. Had she been manipulated, or was she just as guilty as the men who had planned the brutal killing? As the detectives pieced together more of the story, they knew they were getting closer to uncovering the full truth, but there were still more questions to answer. The breakthrough came when the police were able to trace the phone calls between Thuy and the two men Lak Tai and Cao Ludon. The phone records revealed a complex web of lies, manipulation, and deceit. Thuy had been at the center of the conflict, playing both men against each other. And it was this betrayal that led to Enam Kwan's death. But even with this revelation, the final piece of the puzzle was still missing. Who had pulled the trigger? Who had been the mastermind behind this deadly game? With the new evidence in hand, the investigators were closing in on the truth. The mystery was starting to unravel. It was clear that Thu's involvement was far more significant than anyone had imagined. The tangled relationships and hidden secrets were finally coming to light. But the question remained, who had been the one to end Enam Kwan's life? And why had they done it? As the investigation progressed, the focus shifted to the life of the man at the heart of this tragedy, Enam Kwan. A man of routine, a hard-working bus driver from a small town in Luoyang, Enam Kwan was known for his simplicity and dedication. He had lived a quiet life, far from the chaos that would eventually surround his death. But as the investigators dug deeper into his personal life, they discovered a web of complications, particularly surrounding a woman named Thuy. Enam Kwan's life seemed simple, yet it was filled with complexity. He had grown up in a small orphanage, learning the value of independence at a young age. Over the years, he managed to carve out a modest, stable life for himself. His job as a bus driver allowed him to support himself, and he had recently purchased a small house in the town. But it was in his personal relationships that things began to unravel. Enam Kwan had always kept to himself, preferring solitude over socializing. However, things took a turn when he met Thuy, a local woman who had come into his life unexpectedly. What started as a friendship slowly turned into something more. Though Enam Kwan was not one to get entangled in complicated relationships, Thuy had a way of making him feel alive, bringing excitement into his otherwise quiet existence. However, their relationship quickly became a source of tension, not just for Enam Kwan, but for Thuy as well. She was married to another man, Lak Tai, a man with a possessive streak. As Enam Kwan and Thuy's relationship grew, so did the friction between the two men. Lak Tai, feeling betrayed and jealous, began to confront Enam Kwan. This growing hostility would ultimately prove to be the catalyst for the tragic events that followed. Despite the increasing tension, Enam Kwan remained calm, not wanting to escalate things further. He had no desire to fight over a woman, but he was caught in a situation that he didn't know how to escape. His interactions with Thuy were private, yet the whispers in town had already begun. People were talking. They knew about his secret affair, and it wasn't long before Lak Tai found out. While Nham did his best to maintain a low profile, he wasn't immune to the escalating tensions. His colleagues at the transport company had started to notice his distracted demeanor. He seemed different, more distant than usual, and there were rumors about his personal life. But no one, not even his closest friends, could have predicted the chain of events that would unfold from his personal turmoil. By the time Lak Tai's jealousy reached its boiling point, Nham life had already begun to unravel. His job, his relationship with Thuy, and his sense of stability had all been shaken. He had tried to navigate his emotions and relationships without confrontation, but the love triangle was threatening to pull everything he had worked for apart. Still, Nham remained unaware of just how deep Lak Tai's anger ran. As the days went by, the situation only became more volatile. Thuy, too, found herself torn between the two men: her husband, whom she had been with for years, and Nham, the man who had stolen her heart. The emotional turmoil was taking its toll on her as well, but she was determined to keep both men in her life, at any cost. As the tension reached a breaking point, something changed in the air like the calm before a storm. The unresolved conflicts, the jealousy, and the emotional manipulation had built up over time. But it was not until Lak Tai's deep-rooted anger turned into something more dangerous that the true danger became apparent. Nham would soon find out the true cost of being caught in the crossfire of this tragic love triangle. On the afternoon of January 20, 2013, everything came to a head. Nham had planned to meet Thuy, but at the last minute, something changed. Lak Tai was involved, and his jealousy knew no bounds. The combination of rage and resentment led him to make a decision that would alter all their lives forever. Nham was about to become the target of something much more sinister than anyone could have imagined. In that moment, as fate took its cruel turn, the question was no longer about love or betrayal, it was about survival. How far was Lak Tai willing to go to protect his pride and possessiveness? And what role did Thuy play in the destruction of the life that was so carelessly torn apart? Jealousy, lies, and betrayal, these were the silent forces at play, leading to the devastating actions that would unfold. Lak Tai had been driven mad by the notion that his wife, Thuy, had given her heart to another man. But it wasn't just about love anymore, it was about control. And control was something Lak Tai could no longer afford to lose. His mind, clouded by insecurity and rage, was now set on a dangerous path. Lak Tai had always seen Thuy as his possession. He had never quite understood the concept of love being freely shared. For him, it was about ownership. When Thuy met Nham, everything changed. What began as a brief, innocent flirtation between the two spiraled into something far more dangerous. Lak Tai couldn't bear to see her slipping away from him, and that feeling of abandonment became the fuel for his escalating fury. As the affair continued, Lak Tai's suspicions grew. He watched every interaction, every smile between Thuy and Nham, feeling as if he were losing his grip on everything he held dear. Yet, Thuy remained indifferent to his growing jealousy. She wanted the freedom to love whom she chose, but this was a freedom that Lak Tai couldn't accept. Her relationship with Nham had become a point of no return. Despite all the warning signs, Thuy didn't realize how deep Lak Thai's obsession ran. In her mind, she was simply in a relationship with someone who made her happy. But for Lak Thai, it was far more than a simple betrayal, it was an assault on his identity. To him, Thuy's love for another man was the ultimate humiliation. The rage that boiled inside him became a monstrous force, and soon, it would push him to commit an unthinkable crime. Lak Thai's jealousy reached its peak when he realized that Thuy had not only fallen for Nhậm but had kept their relationship secret. He felt betrayed, not just by the woman he loved, but by the fact that she had kept something so significant from him. In his mind, it wasn't just an affair, it was a deliberate act of defiance. Something needed to be done. His ego was wounded, and no amount of emotional reasoning could stop the storm that was about to break. In the days leading up to the murder, Lak Thai started to plan his revenge. It wasn't enough to confront Nhậm or Thuy. He needed to punish them both, to make them understand the depth of his pain. The affair had been a personal attack on him, and now he had to reclaim control. He started making arrangements in secret, contacting his brother, Lak Hong, to help him execute the plan. It was now a matter of pride and revenge. On January 20, 2013, Lak Thai set his plan into motion. He contacted Nhậm under the guise of a friendly arrangement. He knew that Nhậm, ever the helpful man, would jump at the opportunity for extra work. The job was simple: drive a group of workers to Luoyang, and in return, Nhậm would earn extra money. It was an offer too tempting to resist, and Nhậm agreed without hesitation. What Nhậm didn't know was that this seemingly innocent trip would be his last. As Lak Thai and his brother, Lak Hong, drove to meet him, their hearts filled with the certainty of their plan. They were ready. When Nhậm arrived, expecting to earn some extra money, he had no idea that he was walking into a nightmare. The moment he stepped into that car, he sealed his fate. As they drove, Lak Thai waited for the right moment to act. He faked illness, convincing Nhậm to stop at a remote location. It was there, in the middle of nowhere, that Lak Thai made his move. Without warning, he grabbed the prepared cord and wrapped it around Nhậm neck. A moment of panic, a brief struggle, and then silence. Nhậm was no longer breathing. Nhậm fought for his life, but it was no use. Lak Thai's grip was too strong, and with the help of his brother, the two men subdued him. It wasn't a quick death, it was a brutal, suffocating struggle. Lak Thai, with a grim sense of satisfaction, watched as Nhậm life slipped away. And just like that, the man who had unknowingly stolen Thuy's heart was gone. Once Nhậm was dead, they didn't hesitate. They wrapped his body in a heavy sack, weighted it down with rocks, and threw him into the river. The cold waters would carry his body away, hiding the evidence of their crime. The plan had worked. But Lak Thai's triumph was short-lived. The murder was only the beginning of their downfall, and as the body of Nhậm was discovered, the investigation into his death would soon expose the truth. The day had arrived. The plan was set in motion, and everything was calculated. Lak Thai and Lak Hong had already driven halfway, carefully maneuvering their way through the familiar roads. Lak Thai's pulse raced with every mile they covered. He had thought of everything, every detail of this execution was carefully planned. He was no longer the betrayed lover, now, he was the one in control, the one who would decide who lived and who died. As they approached the desolate spot Lak Thai had chosen, a sense of eerie calm washed over him. This was where it would end. He looked at his brother, Lak Hong, who was silent beside him. The two had already spoken, little words weren't necessary. They knew their roles, and the time for talking was over. What they were about to do was irreversible. There would be no going back, no remorse. Just action. When they reached their destination, Lak Tai feigned illness. He had rehearsed this moment many times, playing the part perfectly. Enam Quan, ever the reliable man, immediately stopped the vehicle, his concern evident. But what he didn't know was that this moment of kindness, of being a good Samaritan, would be the very thing that led to his demise. As Lak Tai staggered out of the car, pretending to be dizzy, he motioned for Enam Quan to help him. The moment Enam Quan stepped out of the car to assist him, Lak Hong was already prepared. With a swift motion, Lak Tai grabbed the thick cord from behind the seat and wrapped it around Enam Quan's neck. The suddenness of it caught him off guard. A strangled gasp escaped his throat as he tried to fight back, but it was too late. Enam Quan's struggle was brief but intense. He fought to free himself, his hands clawing at the cord, his legs kicking wildly. But Lak Tai's grip was unrelenting. The anger, the jealousy, and the betrayal fueled Lak Tai's strength. He tightened the cord, feeling the life drain from Enam Quan's body. The sense of power coursed through him as he heard Enam Quan's gasps grow weaker, slower. And then nothing. The deed was done. Enam Quan's body, now lifeless, was sprawled on the ground. Lak Hong stepped forward, helping Lak Tai drag the body back into the car. There was no remorse, no second thoughts. The deed had been committed with cold precision. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about eliminating the threat to what Lak Tai believed was rightfully his. Enam Quan had become an obstacle, and now, he was gone. The next phase of the plan was simple: dispose of the body in a way that would make it almost impossible to trace. Lak Tai and Lak Hong traveled to the river near the Tahan Thuy Bridge, where the calm, slow-moving water would hide the body long enough for them to cover their tracks. They could already hear the rushing water as they neared the spot, the final resting place for Enam Quan. Together, they hauled the heavy sack containing Enam Quan's body to the edge of the bridge. Lak Tai's mind raced as he glanced at his brother. This was the moment of truth. They were about to make sure no one could ever tie them to this crime. Lak Hong, who had been silent throughout, nodded, confirming that they had come this far and couldn't stop now. With a final glance at the body, Lak Tai threw the sack over the edge, watching it fall into the dark water below. As the sack disappeared beneath the surface, Lak Tai let out a slow, controlled breath. It was done. The body would sink, weighed down by the heavy rocks, and the river would carry it away, obscuring any trace of the murder. No one would ever find Enam Quan. They had done everything right. There would be no evidence, no witnesses. It was over. But in that moment, Lak Tai couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was a nagging voice in the back of his mind, a sense of unease that hadn't been there before. It wasn't fear, he had no regrets about what he had done. It was just something he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the finality of it all. Perhaps it was knowing that no matter how far he ran, he would never escape what he had just done. The brothers got back into the car and drove away, the weight of the body now a distant memory. But Lak Tai couldn't escape the haunting thought that this was just the beginning. The act was done, but the consequences? Those were still to come. As they left the quiet of the bridge behind, Lak Tai looked out the window, wondering if anyone would ever suspect him of the crime he had just committed. As the days passed, the investigation into Enam Kwan's disappearance started to intensify. The initial clues had been gathered, but the breakthrough was still elusive. The river had swallowed the body, leaving no trace of its presence. But the police weren't giving up. They knew the key to solving this mystery lay in one crucial piece of the puzzle: the strange behavior of the people around Enam Kwan, and the suspicious events leading up to his disappearance. One of the first breakthroughs came when police reviewed security footage from the local bus station. They saw something that immediately caught their attention: Enam Kwan walking with a young woman in the afternoon of the 20th. This wasn't the first time they had seen her. The woman had been spotted multiple times before, always near Enam Kwan. Her name was Thuy Hong, a local resident who had been interacting with Enam Kwan. The police quickly dug deeper into her background. Detectives began to trace Thuy Hong's movements. They discovered that after spending time with Enam Kwan, she had met another man, a stranger, not long afterward. The strange man was later identified as Cao Ludon, a local from the nearby town. Cao Ludon had no known connection to Enam Kwan, which raised immediate suspicions. Police quickly brought him in for questioning. Cao Ludon initially denied knowing anything about the murder. He claimed he and Thuy Hong had just met through social media, and that he had no connection to the disappearance of Enam Kwan. His story was flimsy, and the investigators knew they were dealing with a man who was hiding something. The pressure mounted on Cao, and eventually, the truth started to crack. After hours of interrogation, Cao Ludon finally confessed to his role in the crime. He admitted that he had met Thuy Hong, and their relationship had quickly become entangled with jealousy and resentment. He had been drawn into Lak Thai's plot when the man had promised him money in exchange for his cooperation. Lak Thai had orchestrated the entire plan, using Cao as an accomplice to help carry out the murder. It was a cold, calculated move, driven by Lak Thai's unrelenting jealousy. With Cao Ludon's confession, the investigation now turned toward Lak Thai. The authorities quickly discovered that he had been on the move, disappearing for several days after the murder. It became clear that Lak Thai had tried to evade capture, but the police were determined. They had already begun to trace his whereabouts using surveillance footage, and it wasn't long before they found him hiding in a remote mountain area. When the police finally cornered Lak Thai, it was clear he had been running for days. His clothes were disheveled, his face drawn and weary from the stress of being hunted. In his eyes, there was no fear, only resignation. He knew the game was over. He had been caught, and there would be no escaping the consequences of his actions. Lak Thai was brought back to the police station, where he was confronted with the evidence against him. Faced with his accomplice's confession and the growing weight of the case, he finally admitted to masterminding the murder. His motive was a twisted blend of love, jealousy, and revenge. He had believed that killing Enam Kwan would sever his ties with Thuy Hong, but in reality, it had only led to his own downfall. The trial for Lak Thai and Lak Hong began shortly after their arrests. The courtroom was filled with tension, as the families of the victim and the accused waited for the final verdict. The judge delivered his decision with a heavy heart. Lak Thai was sentenced to death for his role as the mastermind behind the murder. His actions had not only destroyed a life but had also shattered the lives of everyone connected to him. Lak Hong, though less involved, was given a life sentence for his participation in the crime. The case was a tragic reminder of how unchecked jealousy and love could destroy everything in its path. Lactai's obsession with a woman who was never truly his led to a senseless death. The final twist of fate came when Lactai's own desires turned against him, leading to his downfall and the irreversible destruction of his life. In the end, his misguided actions cost him everything. As we reflect on this case, one question remains: how far would you go in the name of love and jealousy? Would you let obsession dictate your actions? Would you follow through on your darkest desires, or would you stop before it's too late? This case serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked emotions and the destruction they can bring.